Dad reads Sci-fi. The Legacy of Heorot, Chapter 20, Autopsy II. To stand still on the summit of reflection is difficult, and in the natural course of things, who cannot go forward steps back. Gaius Velleius Paterculus, 20 BC to 30 AD. The corpse stretched almost 14 feet from the tip of a rounded snout to the spiked ankylosaur tail. Its bulk filled 2 veterinary tables. Its sour, wet smell hung in the air like a curtain of flies. Its grayish-green hide was rent in a score of places. Ribs poked through in rows of stained ivory, denser and more roughly surfaced than human bone. Its webbed feet were torn and broken. The eyes, once golden, shone dull copper in the unwavering overhead light. Sylvia noticed half a dozen gawking colonists still crowded in the door. Triumph! They weren't there. They laughed at Cadman. Now they gloat. Unfair, and she knew it. But she savored the taste of malice. You have your triumphs. I have mine. She looked to the corner where Cadman stood erect, not bothering to lean against the wall. Cadman has both. It was his radio message. Grendel is dead. Grim humor, that. Grim, but oddly appropriate, even so minutely removed from the horror of year day. In death, the creature ceased to menace their future, and thus assumed an oddly mythic quality. Grendel is dead. It was funny. Even now, so soon after Bobby's death, she knew it was funny. God, she wished she could laugh. Carlos sat slumped in the corner, trying desperately to get drunk enough to cry. Grendel is dead, Sylvia said dully. In the old legend, they nailed Grendel's arm above the entrance to Heorot. She swept her hand to indicate the quarter-ton of quiescent monster flesh. We mutilate corpses, too. Jerry paused in the act of pulling on surgeon's gloves. For answers, I hope. Damn right you'll get answers, Cadman muttered. There are so many questions. Life? Death? Is the nightmare over, or just beginning? Please, Jerry said. I need room to work. Cadman, Carlos, Zach, I'd appreciate it if you remained. Everyone else, please. The doorway cleared and the sheet metal door closed. But Sylvia knew that their audience had not retreated far. Their impatiently shuffling feet and choppy breathing hovered just beyond the threshold of perception. Jerry inhaled deeply. The light from above shimmered around his stick-figure body like an aura. Cassandra program. The jury-rigged computer hummed. Gears chugged and ground. Everyone watched. Then slowly, in jerks, the camera moved to position itself above the table. Jerry nodded thanks towards Carlos. The cameras, like everything else, had been severely damaged during the initial assault. Everything had been designed for durability, but that was on Earth, in a design laboratory, damage simulated by computer, not inflicted by monsters. Now, with Omar Isfahan's help, Jerry was redesigning the system, restoring lost capabilities. This was the first practical test of Cassandra's restoration. The computer hesitated another second, and then the gooseneck camera snaked down. Carlos tore open a pouch of vodka, staring unblinkingly at the corpse. He guzzled half the pouch and coughed as it burned its way down. He handed the rest to Cadman. There were no words. All of Carlos' struggle had been for nothing. Bobby had never come out of shock. Her heart had simply given up. Carlos had not cried. He had simply smashed his fist into the wall, damaging both plaster and knuckles. Without a word, he had gone to the camp liquor supply. No one had tried to refuse him. Now he sat with Cadman, camp comedian, and the tall, hard warrior. Both seemed cut from the same dark, dangerous cloth. Jerry moved the scalpel carefully along the creature's head, slitting and then peeling away the skin, exposing the skull's smooth, barely convex arch. I don't see any fissures at all, he remarked for the record. He switched to the band drill. It whined, etching its way through the tough layer of tissue. The stench of burning bone tickled Sylvia's nostrils through her gauze face mask. Thick-hearted tart, Jerry muttered. This one is definitely older and uglier than the first. Might even be its mama. Grendel and Grendel's mother, Sylvia said. It fits. She winked at Cadman. He pretended to ignore her. You're the one who sent that message, she thought. Jerry lifted a section of skull to expose a pale layer of membrane protecting the brain. Slitting it exposed darkly pinkish jellied pulp. Cassandra, watch this. The camera moved in closer. Jerry dictated in a carefully controlled voice. This has to be olfactory brain tissue. It's well-defined and coterminous with nasal passages, well penetrated with air passages. This critter had one hell of a sense of smell. Behind and above, that is more tissue that has some similarities, but it's also well-defined, and doesn't appear to be part of the olfactory area. If there's any parallel with human evolution, this is the equivalent of cortex, although it sure doesn't look much like what we use for cortex. Lots of convolutions, though. Maybe that's a universal. From the size and shape, if I'm right about what this area is and does, the critter is at least as intelligent as a gorilla, maybe more so. Better sense of smell than a dog or cat. The saw word again. Moving back, there's a whole series of enlarged ganglia complexes. Subsidiary brains, maybe? I know that there are at least 3 more of these down in the lower spinal area. My guess is that they really are subsidiary brains that control reflexes and locomotion. That's one reason the critter can move so fast. The central brain gives orders, but they get carried out by a whole batch of brains distributed along the systems. Computer networks operate that way. Sylvia looked away from the monster and back to Cadman. He was leaning forward, his teeth just showing. Jerry continued to work. His hands moved deftly, guiding the instruments in precise motions, exposing without damaging. From time to time, he called up ultrasound and X-ray images on the computer screen, consulted them, then went back to his grisly task. An hour passed. Presently, Jerry removed some tissue samples. All right, Sylvia, we'll want microscopic examinations of this. Freeze and section and the rest. Sure, she said. She kept her voice pleasant. Sorry. It's all right. Sylvia moved closer. That oversized jaw. The first one was that way, too. Right. Species characteristic, I'd say. Yes, jaw. Oversized feet, webbed but with claws. Designed for fighting, but also for traction. No hands, though. It was never designed as a tool user. Right on that. Carlos took another stiff drink, then slammed the canteen down. He stood, stepping out of the shadow and closer to the table. Traction? Want to see traction? Look at Cadman's ribs. Damned scars haven't healed yet. She could see his eyes now. They were red-rimmed, bright with tears and loathing. That bitch ran right up the cliff. It didn't climb. It sprinted. It just smashed into the boat, chewed it up like a grape skin. Bobby never had a goddamn chance. He was shaking, and seemed to calm only when Cadman clasped his shoulder from behind. The tension drained out of Carlos, and he retreated to the shadows. I saw that too, Cadman said. These things have 2 distinct gears, fast and super fast. I want some answers. You and everyone else, Cadsy. You've done your parts. Leave the rest to us. She felt a kick, a sensation of pulling, of her pelvic girdle stretching, accompanied by momentary faintness. She caught her balance and shut her mind to the fatigue. Sylvie, are you all right? Cadman asked from the shadows. He sees everything. Fine. No, you're not. Good enough. Look, I promise. As soon as we're finished with the preliminaries, I'll take a nap. I just can't miss being in on this one. Saws and drills continued to sing and strip away the skin and the flesh from the thing that had haunted their nightmares, while ultrasound recorders watched and remembered. The dissection would later be computer-corrected to form an in-depth holographic template. Then the analysis could begin. Zack spoke for the first time in hours. I can almost feel sorry for it. He indicated Cassandra and the other complex instruments in the room. It couldn't have known what it was up against. Carlos growled deep in his throat and stood. Before he could move, he was halted by Sylvia's laugh. She looked at Cadman and grinned. No, it couldn't. Carlos sat on his stool as the saw began a new song. They peeled away the ribs. At first Sylvia concentrated on the lungs, flatter than human lungs, less a pair of bags than a webwork with blood vessels running through them. Arteries and veins were thumb-thick, oversized, capable of pumping blood and oxygen to working muscles at a fantastic rate. She could only shake her head in wonder. She probed into the gland sacs, flattened organs perching atop the lungs. "What in the world?" she whispered. "Cassandra, close up." She sliced into them with the tip of her scalpel. The walls were elastic and wrinkled, shrunken to a third the size of the lungs. "Whatever this is, it can hold a lot more than it does right now." A brilliant carmine fluid jellied in the sacs, and she spooned out a sample. "I'm going to run an analysis on this." Sylvia placed the sample in the spare biothermograph ferried down from Geographic. There was a faint humming sound as it pumped the air from the sample chamber. Thank God that this apparatus, at least, had been duplicated. So much equipment had been lost. They would have a hell of a time working out this creature's gene patterns now. Its flesh might have to be preserved for years before such apparatus could be replaced. When the BTG had finished evacuating, the dollop of red fluid was burned in a flash, and a quick band of color flashed across the viewer. Sylvia whispered softly. "Eh?" Jerry prompted. He looked to the screen where the computer analysis of the chromatography would appear. Sylvia's voice was pensive. "How can this stuff be biological? It looks like oxidizer for a rocket. Oxygen bonded with carbon, iron, magnesium, but mostly oxygen. I wouldn't have believed it. What's the structure of those sacs?" "Honeycomb. They were filled with the fluid." He probed with the scalpel, frowned, and cut again. "Huh. Muscle bands. Here. Yep. Set up to constrict the sacs, which would inject this stuff into the bloodstreams. The duct leads directly into the heart chambers. Super oxygenated blood supplement," Sylvia said. "Which means—" "Right," Jerry shouted. "That's it. Supercharger. Good Lord, no wonder this thing is so damn dangerous." "What?" Zach demanded. "What have you found?" Jerry almost danced with excitement. "This is it. I'm sure of it." "How can you be so damned happy about how powerful this thing is?" Carlos demanded. "Don't you see?" Sylvia said. "See what?" Jerry brought calm back to his voice. "The monster depends on superoxygenation. That means it's vulnerable. We can kill it." "Maybe I'm stupid," Zach said, "but I don't see—" Jerry ignored him. "Cadman, was there, say, anything unusual about the amount of body heat from this thing? You've been closer than anyone." Cadman paused for a moment, then spoke. "Yes, damn it, there was. When the first one killed Ernst at the blind, it was stalking the calf, and everything was fine. But as soon as we took a shot at it, the temperature went through the roof. Enough to cause a flare in your infrared, as I recall." "Right." Jerry took a step back from the graying thing on the tables. The dead, cold hulk, leaking blood and cloudy fluid, dropped by a slow drop onto the stained tile floor. "And amphibian. We'll never find these things far from water. They need to dump the heat. Listen, there can't be many of these things on the island." Carlos cursed vilely and smashed his pouch to the ground. "I swear to God, the next idiot who says that, I'm going to break his face. Shit." He kicked at the plastic skin, squirting liquid out into a puddle. Cursing again, he scooped it off the floor and stormed out of the room. "Before it was a guess," Jerry said. He didn't sound worried. "Now we know." "Know what?" "There can't be many of them. By many, I mean more than a dozen or so. Cadman, there's not enough for them to eat. Look at the teeth. A couple of grinders. They can crunch seeds and grass and bark in a pinch, but they're sure as hell not evolved for eating plants. They want meat, and lots of it. And there just isn't enough meat on this island." "The pterodons," Sylvia said. "That's why they were so scared of the water. These things hide in the water. The poor pterodons. They have to fish, but they never know when they dive for a salmon. But one of these things will be waiting for them." "Right." Jerry stepped back from the table and dropped his mask. "Look, we can wait for the computer analysis, but we don't really need it, do we? We had a brood of them. Heck, this one might well have been the mother. Picture her swimming over, or floating over on a piece of driftwood, or any other scenario you like. She's already pregnant, with a clutch of eggs, ready to be laid. Land her 10 or 20 years ago, perhaps, and they proceed to strip the island of animal protein. Everything except Samlin, Sylvia said. Yeah, Jerry looked thoughtful. And there is our next big mystery. There is no Samlin in her stomach. What protects Samlin? Maybe our monster only hunts on the land? And by the way, we need a name for this thing. We can't just keep calling it Monster. Sylvia forced a smile. I think Cadman already named it. Grendel. Name it damned. Name it be damned, Cadman said. You said it was vulnerable. How vulnerable? In a minute, Jerry said, Damn, it really is a puzzle. These things eat everything. Have eaten everything. They damn near stripped this island clean. Sylvia, it all fits. Dopey Joes in the hills, none near water. Pterodons, nothing else. Everything but the Samlin. All right. What keeps the Grendels from eating all the Samlin? Poisonous? Sylvia asked, or... Oh, damn. What? Something. I have the feeling I'm forgetting something. Can't be important. Maybe. Anyway, could Samlin be poison to Grendels? Doesn't seem reasonable. They ate cattle. We eat Samlin. Yeah. Or, Jerry said, maybe Grendel only hunts warm-blooded creatures. Given its choice, sure, Cadman said, that bitch would eat her own children if she were hungry enough. Believe it. I don't know what to believe now. That's what we're... Jerry's voice faded out, and Sylvia groped for support as the room seemed to ripple and she lost her footing. Cadman was under her in an instant, and the last thing that she felt before darkness overwhelmed her was the comforting strength of his arms and his whispered words, I'm here. Sylvia's eyes were open, but totally unfocused. Light and shadow mingled indeterminably. As her senses returned, she heard the slow rumble of Terry's breathing, and finally realized that she was in her own bedroom. Somewhere outside her window, men were arguing. She recognized the voices. Stu Ellington and Carlos. Both sounded horribly drunk. The hell, Marika? You think you could have done better? Don't have to think. You killed her. You left her and ran, you dickless wanderer. She heard the sharp, sudden sound of bone meeting bone, and the side of her cabin shuddered as a body slammed into it. Briefly, the shadow of two struggling bodies fell across the window. She watched the dark, shifting shapes, overcome with an hallucinogenic sense of unreality. Another sharp crack. Gasps, a creak of tortured metal, the stifled sobs of pain and anger, a swift curse in Spanish, and a softer thud. Then Cadman's voice. Break it up. All right. You've both had enough. We have bigger fight than this. There were a few more muttered words, then the voices faded. The shadows dissolved before the sweep of the searchlight melded into the darkness, and once again the night was still. Sylvia rolled over and hit the light. Terry reached for the trapeze bar above his head and pulled himself upright. You're awake. Only when I heard the racket, her head buzzed hollowly. Somebody tranked me. Damn, listen, you haven't had a full night's sleep for 3 days, and I want you to get one. You've been running on adrenaline. His hand slipped from her chest to her belly, the warm, gentle swell there, and she suddenly realized the truth in his words. Both of her needed rest, and food. Now that the adrenaline rush had slowed, she could hear the dull roar of hunger and fatigue. The tensions had masked it, the tension of waiting, of helplessly watching the search for Carlos and Bobby, of watching Cadman and the others descend into the earth to do battle with the unknown, of standing at Marnie's shoulder, waging a losing battle for Bobby's life, of waiting to convey the terrible news to Carlos, if Carlos survived. There could have been no rest. But now, Terry was right. Carlos and Stu just needed to get it out. They'll probably cover each other's back tomorrow. There's nothing anyone can do for it. He ran his hands lovingly through her hair, scratching her scalp with the tips of his nails. And anyway, I'm here to make sure that you don't go running off. Junior needs you to be reasonable. For an instant, she thought of arguing. Then fatigue completed what tranquilizers and low blood sugar began, and she slipped back into a light and fitful sleep. When Sylvia finally emerged from the caverns of narcosis some 10 hours later, the camp was on full alert. The minefields beyond the perimeter fence were activated. Current pulsed through the wire. Sylvia's skin hummed as if she approached it too closely. She wrapped her sweater around her more tightly and headed through the thin morning fog toward the communal dining hall. In the midst of total alert, she felt a curious security. The colony was not pitted against human enemies. It's only an animal, intelligent as a gorilla, maybe as intelligent as a primitive human. Doesn't matter. They can't use tools. It's only an animal. We, Cadman, hunted it down, went into its den, and it wasn't a dragon at all. Only an animal with a brain smaller than a man's, and no tools. A tiger in the dark room is a monster. Turn on the light and it's just an animal. Cadman turned on the lights for us. Zack held the door for her as she entered the dining hall. She asked him, "How's Carlos?" "Sleeping it off. Stu has a busted lip. Well earned if you ask me." Virtually every adult male and half the women were clustered in the hall. The walls and ceiling of the hall were illuminated with views of the colony and points south. Cadman stood in the front of the room. Near him, but separated, were 10 colonists, his kill team. He stands there. Does he know just how arrogantly he's standing there? But the rest of them, they're taking it seriously. They accept it. I never saw him like this before, in his element. The bad time is over for Colonel Cadman Wayland. One of the wall videos wavered, and Cadman's face loomed into focus. "We'll be using a portable hollow system," he continued. "Rachel will carry it into the first assault, and I want her to stay back. The idea here is to perfect a system. If we make any mistakes, we want the camp to know it fast. If we do it right, we can be sure that the National Geographic people will be interested. This will head back to Earth along with the rest of the data on Grendels. George, Jill, you'll bracket the pool here and here." Sylvia looked at the maps. One was a digitalized thermal breakdown representing fresh water, hot springs, and vegetation. On the other wall was a contour map, and on a third, a wildlife vector. Greatest concentrations of salmon had been detailed. 4 of the water holes had been identified as likely hidey holes. These had large populations of salmon and no hot springs nearby. Grendels would want cold water to dump heat into. Distance from the other holes was an important factor. Any creature as voracious as a Grendel had to be extremely territorial, requiring substantial hunting ground. Sylvia found her eyes drawn time and again to the center maps. The colony. A small area, really. Terribly small when examined in contrast to the entire island. Barely 2 square kilometers. The view from Geographic made hollow their assertions of mastery. From that perspective, how very little change they had wrought. So presumptuous had been the children of Earth. When all was said and done, might not this new world, this terribly old world, swallow them in their folly, leaving nothing behind but bones? Bones, and some films beamed back to an Earth that might or might not send others this way again. Earth was rich and jaded. She touched her belly, trying to sense the slumbering life within. It shifted, kicking, and suddenly she felt awesomely small and vulnerable. What was she doing here? What were any of them doing here? All she could think of was the image of that hideous beast, twisting through the searchlights, sprinting forward like a wind-up toy with a broken spring, bathed in flame, skin coated in jellied gasoline, bile sanity dead, but living still. God in heaven. Then there were the Knights of Avalon, men and women descending into the caves beneath the northern ravine. There in the abysmal darkness, confronting a larger, more powerful version of the first beast, armed with better weapons, more certain knowledge, and something else, the kind of foolhardy courage that had lured men beyond the edge of shadow since time immemorial. Now, 40 grim, determined men and women waited, armed and ready. Waited to follow the camp's only true warrior into hell, if need be, to stand between Sylvia's unborn child and the hideous grasp of a Grendel. Suddenly, her eyes blurred with tears, and an unbidden, heartfelt prayer echoed in her mind. God be with you, Cadman, because the devil has already dealt himself in.